Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with Malcolm London and just so many good friends and fighters in this movement, and to be back where the revolt against corporate education reform first exploded. It is wonderful. And the last time I was here at a CTU-sponsored event was in 2013. It was actually during the MAP test boycott. I came to share some of the lessons when the entire faculty of my high school refused to administer the measures of academic progress test. You know, we were threatened with a 10-day suspension without pay, and when I was here, we didn't know what the outcome of that was going to be. And I was very happy to say that not only did none of the teachers get reprimanded for refusing to administer it, but they actually canceled the test altogether for high schools, and they never have to give it again in Seattle. It was a huge victory that, you know, we were inspired by your struggle. We took that step, and then, you know, Sarah Chambers here and the teachers at Saucedo Elementary also refused to give the ISAT and inspired a whole new wave of resistance across the country. You know, right now there are 180,000 documented, but it's climbing, maybe tens of thousands more than that, opt-outs in New York State. There was the largest walkout against high-stakes testing in U.S. history in Colorado when thousands of students refused to take end-of-course exams. You had over 1,000 students in New Mexico refuse to take the PARCC test and walk out in a mass rally. We are currently in the midst of the largest uprising in U.S. history against high-stakes testing. It's exploding around the country. In my own city at Garfield High School, a lot of people were wondering what's going to happen now that the new Common Core test. Okay, you boycotted the MAP, what's going to happen with Common Core? And first there was a high school up north named Nathan Hale that kicked things off by saying, we're not going to administer the new Common Core test. So now they kind of one-upped us. Right? So now what are we going to do? We're sweating. Because the superintendent came out and he said, well, anybody who refuses to administer these tests will have their teaching certificate revoked, right? Out of the playbook that they threatened the Saucedo teachers with, right? And so now we were facing that. Are we willing to take these people on knowing that they're going to revoke teaching certificates? And we were debating back and forth what to do, and then a funny thing happened. It turns out that those 9th graders who were being asked to take the MAP and opted out, refused to take it, and we didn't administer it back in 2013, are the very 11th graders they're asking to take the SBAC's Common Core test. And in fact, our school was flooded with hundreds of opt-out letters, so many that we couldn't administer the test because there weren't enough kids eligible to take it. So the decision was taken out of our hands, and at Nathan Hale, they already finished administering it. Guess how long it took? There was 0 students that took the test at Nathan Hale High School, and the revolt is just growing and spreading, and it's a beautiful thing to see these corporate reformers scrambling, trying to figure out how to respond to this mass uprising. And you know, the testocracy, as I call them, one of their leaders is Arne Duncan, who's pushing this reform, this whole reform thing. And you heard his famous quote recently. I want to read it to you. He said, he talked about our movement to refuse the Common Core testing, and he said, the opposition to this is from white suburban moms who all of a sudden their child isn't as brilliant as they thought they were, and their school isn't quite as good as they thought they were. That comment is deeply offensive for a lot of reasons. I'll go through a couple. One, suburban moms have a right to have their kid also not have a meaningful education, right? But it ignores, I think, the leadership that has emerged all over this country of black people and people of color who are leading a revolt against these high-stakes standardized tests. Has he met Karen Lewis or heard of her? Right? The parents at Castlebridge Elementary, there's a chapter in the book by one of those parents, were 3 co-parents of the PTA at that school in New York, and they had so many opt-outs of their elementary school they had to cancel the test because of their leadership, all women of color, Asian and Latino, who are leading that opt-out struggle. You have, you know, the Newark Student Union led by young black scholars who are, you know, staging sit-ins. The same thing, I just came from Baltimore, where the Baltimore Algebra Project students led a sit-in of the Board of Education there when schools were threatened because they were labeled failing. And then in my own city, we had an amazing occurrence happen where the Seattle NAACP joined us in a press conference to announce that the opt-out movement is part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they called on all families to opt their children out of Common Core testing this year. And I'm happy to say that Rita Green, the education chair of the Seattle NAACP chapter, she is on the way right now. Her flight was late, and so she's in a taxi, but I hope that you'll be able to hear from her in a moment. But I think it's important to understand the powerful contribution of black parents, students, and teachers around the country in actually helping to lead this movement. And I think many families of color are joining this movement because of what educators have known for a long time. There's a school-to-prison pipeline. We've talked about it a lot, right? It starts when the curriculum doesn't reflect our culture, right? Or respect black kids and other kids of color, and doesn't talk about our contributions and our struggles. And it erases us, and so necessarily students rebel. And what happens when they rebel? Well, there's a zero-tolerance discipline in place that pushes them out of the classroom, and we know that those kids disproportionately are suspended and disproportionately are pushed out of school and end up in prison. And we also know that high-stakes testing is a central feature of the school-to-prison pipeline. There's a study that came out of Boston University recently that confirmed what we all knew. These exit exams, they require you to pass these tests. It doesn't matter what your teacher thought of you. It doesn't matter the contributions you made to your community. What you score on that one day, right, is the outcome of if you graduate or not. And the study reveals that the #1 outcome of high-stakes exit exams, it had no impact on what jobs you get, on your pay, right? The only impact it had was increased incarceration rates, right? This in a peer-reviewed journal. And the fact that Arne Duncan is silent on that reveals everything about the hypocrisy of these corporate reformers. But I think increasingly, it's not just the school-to-prison pipeline that we need to talk about. I think it's a school-to-grave pipeline, right? What else do you call what happened to Tamir Rice, right? Or to Mike Brown, who had just graduated on his way to college before he's shot down by unaccountable police. And I think that we have to think about what Darren Wilson said about Mike Brown, right? You guys read that testimony in the grand jury when he called Mike Brown a Hulk, and then he called him a demon, right? How did he get away with dehumanizing him, seeing him as less than a human being so he could shoot him down? And why did that narrative strike a chord and make sense to that jury, right? Why were they able to say that this young black man was less than human? Well, there's a lot of things. There's this racist war on drugs that's labeled black people criminals, and the media that tells that story day in and day out, right? But I would argue that this high-stakes testing regime and standardized testing is a big way that they use to dehumanize black people, people of color, and I think, you know, working class and poor people all over the country. This use of high-stakes tests to dehumanize black people has a long history that we need to uncover and understand. Because, you know, their narrative is we got to have these tests because they're going to help us close the achievement gap. It's going to identify where there's failures, and it's going to help us close the achievement gap. And the whole edifice of high-stakes standardized testing rests on that narrative, right? And so once we can understand where that narrative falls short, we can undo their testing regime. And if you know where high-stakes testing, how and when it entered the public schools, you'll understand the absurdity of the idea that these tests are going to help us close the achievement gap, because they entered the public schools in the early 1900s as part of the eugenics movement, right? An openly white supremacist ideology. Not just white supremacists, but it was designed to prove that men were superior to women, right? That native-born were superior to immigrants. This ideology espoused even that the northern fairer-skinned Europeans were superior to the swarthy Mediterranean Europeans, right? Just this absurd science about feeling bumps on your head and understanding your intelligence. And one of the champions of this eugenics movement was Karl Bringem. He was a professor at Princeton University. And he left his post at Princeton during World War I to bring IQ tests into the military. He wanted to rank and sort the troops to who was going to be the grunt soldiers who were going to go die in the trenches and who were going to be the officers to oversee the slaughter. And then he returned to Princeton after the war, and he massaged these tests to become the SAT exam, right? That's where the SAT comes from. And in fact, it was by the early 1920s, Alan Stefkop writes, by the early 1920s, more than 2 million American school children were being tested primarily for academic tracking purposes. At least some of the decisions to allocate resources and select for students for academic or vocational courses were influenced by eugenic notions of student worth. And so that early history of using these tests openly as a project of white supremacy, it shouldn't surprise you then that it was black intellectuals and black radicals that were some of the first people to organize to fight against this standardized testing regime. W.E.B. Du Bois among them, right? One of the founders of the NAACP. I wish the national NAACP would go back and read their founders' documents, right? And listen to the Seattle chapter's statement, because W.E.B. Du Bois wrote this: "It was not until I was long out of school, and indeed after the First World War, that there came the hurried use of the new technique of psychological tests, which were quickly adjusted so as to put black folk absolutely beyond the possibility of civilization." And Horace Mann Bond, another important black intellectual at the time, wrote a piece called Intelligence Tests and Propaganda. And I want to just quote from that briefly, because I think it is just as true today about these tests and what they measure. He says, "But so long as any group of men attempts to use these tests as funds of information for the approximation of crude and inaccurate generalization, so long we must continue to cry, 'Hold.' To compare the crowded millions of New York's East Side with the children of Morningside Heights," an upper-class neighborhood at the time, "indeed involves a great contradiction. And to claim that the results of the tests given to such a diverse group, drawn from such a varying strata of the social complex, are in any way accurate is to expose the sense of unfairness and lack of appreciation of the great environmental factors of modern life, right? He's saying that what these tests measure are your access to resources, right? And we still haven't learned that lesson to this day, and we are still in that fight trying to make it clear that these high-stakes standardized tests are a better measure of your zip code, right? What neighborhood you live in, the wealth that surrounds you, rather than your aptitude, right? And how do these tests work? How do they decide how to make these tests and what questions go on them? Well, they often embed questions in the tests that students are taking as trial questions, right? And then if they deem that question to be valid, then they put it on the next test, right? So how do they decide if this practice question was valid or not? Well, if too many kids get it right, then it's going to skew the results, right? And so this question, all of a sudden, a lot more kids got right, and so we actually have to take that one out, and we can't use that. It's not a valid. It doesn't give you that nice curve that, you know, fails a good number of people, a few do really well, and most are in the middle, right? So a question where students of color and lower income students do really well in, there's going to be more people doing well on that question. And that one gets thrown out. And that's the basic standard practice of how you construct a standardized test in this country that is fundamentally flawed. We know that all the advantages that wealthy families have and predominantly white families have of being able to hire test prep tutors, right? Of having the resources in the home to prepare all go into why whiter, predominantly wealthier families score better on these exams, right? And from the early 1900s to today, the scores have been fairly stable in how they've been able to rank and sort for race and class, and they have nothing to do with closing the achievement gap. And so they systematically underfund our schools, especially in the black neighborhoods, and then they register the results with these tests. And I think that makes it easier for people like Darren Wilson to shoot down Mike Brown. They're not shooting down a human being. They're shooting down a failure, right? They're shooting down somebody who has been labeled a number, a score, and is not fully human. And what happens when Darren Wilson shoots down Mike Brown? Does he go to jail, right? Absolutely not. You can choke someone to death on camera, right? And even that, because Eric Garner wasn't fully human in this system, that officer doesn't get arrested. Who does go to jail? How about the black teachers in Atlanta? They go to jail in this system. That's the type of justice system we have in this country. It says, well, these cheaters have to go to jail. Well, nobody thinks that, condones what they did or thinks that erasing scores is the solution to this struggle. But when you have bankers sabotage the global economy and not one goes in handcuffs, right? And when you have a whole education system set up to cheat kids out of a real meaningful education, I don't think that that's justice, sending those black educators to jail. I think we have to totally reframe the purpose of education and what our schools should be about. And this was really driven home for me this year. And I'll end on talking about how to reframe education here. But this was driven home for me because I'm a parent now of a public school student. My then 5-year-old entered kindergarten, and they had this huge ribbon cutting ceremony at my son's school this year. And it was wonderful because it became a bilingual program. So there's Mandarin immersion and Spanish immersion. They renamed the school, and it was this big, wonderful event. And they had all these politicians come out. They had district officials there. The principal gave a wonderful speech. And then the governor's education aide took the podium. And here's all the kids spread out on the grass on the front lawn listening to this. And she takes the microphone and she looks out on the kids and she says, I want to congratulate you all for making this wonderful decision to come to this school this year, because now you will be ready to compete in the global economy. Cheers did not erupt from the 3rd grade section. I wasn't like, yes, my son can learn Spanish so he can keep some other father's son down in Mexico. That's exactly why he's coming to this bilingual program, right? It's like I wanted him to learn Spanish so he could communicate with more people on the planet and work together with them. I'll just read from you real quick. In the preface to the book, I did some research on Common Core, and I found this gem on the Common Core website. This is why we need these tests, right, and the Common Core. From Edward B. Russ Jr., the CEO of State Farm Insurance Companies, this huge pull-out quote on the sidebar of the Common Core website. He says, state-by-state adoption of these standards is an important step towards maintaining our country's competitive edge. With the skilled and prepared workforce, the business community will be better prepared to face the challenges of the international marketplace. So school is about preparing businesses to make more money. It's not about helping my son learn how to interact better with his peers, or help a kid who's had a bad day, right? Or be more creative, or figure out how to solve problems together, right? They've eliminated that and boiled it down to global competition. And that's not good enough for our communities, because we face amazing challenges in our world today. Social catastrophes. We have endless wars. We're spending trillions of dollars to bomb children, and we can't fix up the classroom in our own cities. We have the worst economic inequality in world history, where 85 people have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people. And that means that this year, over half of our children that come to school are in poverty. You guys saw that study? Right? We have mass incarceration, where you have more black people behind bars on probation or parole than were slaves on plantations in 1850. And it's not just about when you're in prison, because as Michelle Alexander writes in The New Jim Crow, you get out, and then most of the laws that applied in the Jim Crow South now apply to you. You can't get a job, right? You can't get access to higher education, etc. We have violence against women and a rape culture that just flourishes in this country. That's disgusting, right? 1 in 4 women report having faced sexual assault in our society. That's something that education should have something to say about, right? And, you know, we have more families being deported because they're undocumented than ever before. And climate change, I think, is the one that if we don't get that right, none of the other problems can be solved, because if the climate raises by 3, scientists tell us that it could be runaway climate change that's irreversible, and then the planet will no longer be able to sustain human life. Right? Those are the real high stakes. And none of those problems can be solved by bubbling A, B, C, or D. Right? If figuring out how to get rid of police terror was on the test, they wouldn't have to ask me to give it. I'd be the first one signing up for it, right? But the real issues that our communities face aren't part of these tests. And so we have to redefine the purpose of education and join in a struggle together to achieve that. So thanks, everybody.